بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So inshallah in today's lecture we will conclude the section of the general statements al-am, and in that we will talk about some of the phrases and the linguistic constructs that we find in the Quran, like when Allah Ta'ala says Ya ayyuhan nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or Ya ayyuhan nas, or when Allah Ta'ala addresses Ahlul Kitab. So we want to know in those statements, are they general statements that they include everybody, or are they specific statements, do they include some people, not some people? So we're going to look at that. And that will be the concluding part of the general statement. Then the general statements. Then we will move into al-khas, the specifying the speech. Of course, we will begin with the definition of what that means, and then we will look at if the statement is using the plural, how can it be specified? And then we will look about specifying it. Can you specify something that's a general statement? Can you specify it to only one person or one, etc.? And then moving from that, we will look at when a part of a speech is specified, what is meant by that which is specified. Is it a linguistic specification, or is it a specifying vis-a-vis the ruling, the hukum? That's a little bit of a theoretical conversation, because at the end of the day, obviously the ruling is going to be specified, because that's what we're after here in fiqh, but we'll talk about it nonetheless. And then following that, we will look at the hujjiyah, we will look at the proof of a speech that has been specified. So general speech, when I say specified, it means that there's a general statement that has been specified. That's sort of what we're after, and obviously it's a proof, that's why we're talking about it. But why is it a proof, and how is it a proof? And that even after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those parts of the speech or the parts of the Sharia that were general and have been specified remain specified and remain valid for us to act upon. That's where we're going to stop. Of course, the khas, like the am, is a very long conversation. It will take us several lectures, inshallah. But those are the main topics for today's lecture. We'll begin, inshallah, in the next clip. So we'll begin the way we normally begin, which is to look to the original text. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. وأن نحو يا أيها النبي لا يشمل الأمة. So Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Phrases like the verse, O Prophet, Ya ayyuhan Nabi, do not include the whole nation of Islam. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan Nabi, or the derivatives of that, Ya ayyuhal muzammil, Ya ayyuhal muddathir, those are addressed to the Prophet ﷺ specifically. So off the bat, that is a specifying thing, and the default understanding is not going to be that it's a general statement. Now, that does not mean that there can be some type of tafsir or some type of implication of those verses for everybody else. Like when Allah Ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ahzab, the first verse of Surah Al-Ahzab, Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu ittaqillah, O Prophet, be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, we all have to be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there are general implications. Here we're not so much looking at that type of tafsir. That's like what's the right word? It's like a general type of tafsir. Here we are looking at the mechanics. We're like really into the details, the weeds. We're looking into the mechanics of these statements and looking at, can such a statement be applied generally, or is it specific? Well, clearly it's specific because it is addressed to the Prophet ﷺ. Ya ayyuhal muzammil, ya ayyuhal muddathir. I mean, those are from the first verses that were revealed upon the Prophet ﷺ. And obviously we know the stories behind them, and then that they are specific. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَأَنَّ نَحْوَ يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ يَشْمَلُ الرَّسُولِ وَإِنِ اقْتَرَنَ بِقُلْ وَأَنَّهُ يَعُمُّ الْعَبْدَ وَيَشْمَلُ الْمَوْجُودَيْنِ فَقَطْ الْمَوْجُودِينَ فَقَطْ عفوا. And other, in the same vein, phrases in the Quran like, O people, Ya ayyuhan nas, include the Prophet ﷺ, because the Prophet ﷺ is one of people, ahadun min nas, he's a man, alayhi salatu wasalam. So the verse construct, Ya ayyuhan nas, is a general statement that also includes the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, even if it is joined with the command qul. So the command form to deliver the message, qul, even though in the context of the verse it might be addressed in the following way, that Allah Ta'ala is revealing the Quran to the Prophet ﷺ, say, meaning say to the people, right, around you. That's a type of specifying, but the Quran is revelation, so it is, valid for all time, place, and circumstance. It's Allah Ta'ala's eternal, uncreated speech, as we know from our theology. So therefore, it's a general statement. So even if there's the command of the Prophet ﷺ through the command verb, the command form of the verb to say, to speak, qul, qala, qul, that's considered a general statement. And phrases like, "O people," include the Prophet ﷺ, even if it's the command joined with the command qul. So even though the Prophet ﷺ is conveying the message to other people, he's also included in what needs to be conveyed. It also includes slaves. So slaves are people, and the problem of slavery, we've talked about slavery all the time throughout all of my lectures. I always make a comment about it, but as I think I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, in this unit, the reason why we include slavery in a lot of our legal discussions is that it presents a legal issue. I'm not talking about the moral issue. The moral issue it's reprehensible. We understand that. But here we're talking about the legal issue. When we talk about qiyas al-shabah, when we talk about types of consensus, types of analogy in which there is something that is unclear, we use, I think we did this in the waraqat class, we use slavery as an example. Is the slave considered property or considered a person? Forget about the moral argument. I'm just keep your mind thinking strictly on the legal aspect. That's a very interesting legal discussion. Is this, this is only a pen? Or is it a weapon? If it's used to kill somebody, la qaddar Allah. In the Sharia, or in the fiqh of crimes and punishments, there's a different rule. There's a different amount set. Sometimes your mind is too faster than what you want to speak. In the laws of punishments, crimes and punishment, there are different rulings associated for weapons that can only be used as weapons, or instruments that are not typically weapons but could be used as weapons. So if I had a knife or a sword or a gun and I attacked somebody, that's clear-cut, voluntary manslaughter. But if I threw a book at somebody, a thick book, and the spine of the book hit the person like this, because this is the thickest part of the book, and then the person fell and hit their head on the floor and died, that's involuntary because the book is not used as a weapon. But in that case, we have one item, the book, that can either be used as a weapon or has a normal usage. So because that's a little obtuse, we use the issue of slavery because it is very apparent that it is bought and sold, but at the same time they are human being. Again, the moral issue aside. So the reason he's including it here is he's saying, Ya ayyuhan nas includes the slaves because they are human beings from that point of view of they have taklif. I hope that point is clear and not lost on you. So the phrase we're talking about, Ya ayyuhan nas, it includes the Prophet ﷺ, even if it's associated with the command qul. So the Prophet ﷺ is the one conveying, but he's also conveying to himself. And number two, it includes slaves. And number three, only those present. That's the default understanding. But through consensus, it does include others as well. So the default understanding of the verse is that it is directed to those who are general, for those who are present. But we're not going to say that the Sharia was only for them, because we have ijma', we have consensus that it also applies to us, but that requires another set of dalil. Here another set of proofs. Here we're speaking about from the mechanics of how we understand the Quran and Sunnah. a verse that says Ya ayyuhan nas, it's general, it includes the Prophet ﷺ, it includes slaves, and is directed to the people at the time that are present at the time. And then by extension, through other proofs, i.e. ijma', consensus, it applies to us, so on and so forth. وأن من يشمل النساء وأن جمع المذكر السالم لا يشملهن ظاهرا. The preposition men includes women. So if you said to somebody, أكرم من في الدار, honor those people, or أطعم من في الدار, feed those people in the house, men في الدار, those who are in the house. Men in the Arabic language is typically used للعاقل, is typically used for rational people. However, it can be used for non-rational people. And I've mentioned this before, like in the first hadith, al-hadith al-musalsal bil-awwaliyya, in which the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, الراحمون يرحمهم الرحمن تبارك وتعالى ارحموا من في الأرض يرحمكم أو يرحمكم من في السماء. ارحموا من في الأرض, have mercy to those on earth. The default definition would be to all people, but it can be used لغير العاقل. Men can also be used for non-rational, so I like to translate it to show mercy on all people and things on earth. However, that's not our context here. Here we're just talking about people. So men it includes women. It's not just for men, not just for men. Men, the preposition is not just for men. It's for men and women. The preposition men includes women. So for example, Allah Ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, verse 124, وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِنَ الصَّالِحَاتِ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى. So whoever does good from men and from women. So here Allah Ta'ala is demonstrating that the men is also used for men and for women and men. Let me say it in reverse order so we don't get men and min confused. So anytime we find the preposition men in the primary sources, we are automatically referring to both men and women together. Okay, let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so we said that the preposition men includes women, and then he says وَأَنَّ جَمْعَ الْمُذَكِّرِ السَّالِمَ لَا يَشْمَلُهُنَّ ظَاهِرًا. As for the sound male plural, like المدرسون, المهندسون, una, ina, المهندسون ورأيت المهندسين. The engineers, and I saw the engineer, one is in one case and the other is in another case. That's what we call Jam'a Mudhakkar Salim. So when you have the Jam'a Mudhakkar Salim, the sound male plural, it does not include women apparently, but it is implied. So, and this is important because this impacts translation, understanding first and foremost, impacts translation, and is something that with all of the gender wars in the Western world primarily, this part unfortunately is lost. So this is very, very fundamental for us to understand. When you have the sound male plural in the Quran and Sunnah, it includes men and women. That's what we're saying. It doesn't include it apparently because it's Jam'a Mudhakkar Salim, it's the sound male plural. But included in that are women. So I don't always have to say the male engineers and the women engineers, the male students and the women students, etc. Allah has there is a verse in the Quran, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ الصالحون والصالحات, etc. to the end of the verse. Maybe I got that verse wrong, I apologize. But everyone knows that verse that I'm talking about, in which Allah Ta'ala differentiates the men, the believing men, and the believing women. The men that pray, the women that pray. الصائمون والصائمات, the men that fast, the women that fast. الذاكرون الله كثيرا والذاكرات, the men that remember Allah Ta'ala often and the women that remember Allah Ta'ala. So that's a unique verse in which Allah gives us both. But the default, when Allah Ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhal mu'minun, O you who believe, that means men and women. He doesn't have to keep differentiating it, and that's how the language works. So it is not included in the apparent speech, because the apparent speech is that it's a sound male plural, but it is implied in the speech. وأن خطاب الواحد لا يتعداه. Speech towards one person is not meant for another. And that's a type of specifying. So when somebody speaks to somebody directly and there's something specific, that means that speech is intended for that person. Again, there can be other mitigating circumstances in how we understand things, but here we're just talking about, again, to repeat, the mechanics about everything. Okay. Where am I here? Okay. وأن الخطاب يا أهل الكتاب لا يشمل الأمة. Speech in the verse, O people of the book, يا أهل الكتاب, does not include Muslims. In the dominant opinion. The other opinion says we are Ahlul Kitab, right? Because we have the Quran. So one of the problems, if I read it that way, that I just left it, you would kind of assume, and unfortunately many modern Muslims have this assumption, that there's us and then there's the Ahlul Kitab, or there's us and the Kuffar, and there's us Ahlul Kitab and the Kuffar. But we forget that we are Ahlul Kitab, because we are very much Ahlul Kitab, because we have a book, which is the Quran. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So we are included in Ahlul Kitab from the point of view of that we have a book and they have a book, etc. But the reason the dominant position is that Ya Ahlul Kitab does not include the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is because sometimes those verses, there is a type of critique of the belief of Ahlul Kitab. However, in the verses that are directed to Ahlul Kitab, that have to do with things that we also do with, then we would say that we are included in that speech. And then he says, وَنَحْوَ خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ يَقْتَضِي الْأَخْذَ مِنْ كُلِّ نَوْعٍ. And in the phrase such as take from their wealth, this is in Surah At-Tawbah 103, right? Yeah, Tawbah 103. It means all types. So take from their wealth, meaning all types of wealth. It's a type of general statement. Except if there's a dalil that specifies. So we know that in the modern world, we consider certain things as assets and wealth, but not all of those things that we consider assets and wealth are necessarily things in which there is a zakat on. So zakat is on gold and silver, zakat is on fiat currencies, zakat is on certain type of livestock, zakat is on certain type of fruits, trade goods, treasure, ar-rikaz, my favorite kind of zakat. Always pray one day I would be a treasure hunter and to find treasure and pay the 20% zakat happily, so on and so forth. But you don't pay zakat on land, you don't pay zakat, it's on things like that. So it's a general statement. خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَاتٍ, take from their wealth, so the zakat or the zakat. It's a general statement, but we know that it is restricted through dalil when we gather all of our sources. Okay, I think that part is clear. Thus concludes the section on al-am, or the general statements, general speech. Now we move into at-takhsis, which is specifying speech. So he says, rahimahullah, التخصيص قصر العام على بعض أفراده. Very concise, beautiful definition. Specifying speech, unfortunately I didn't capture the elegance of that in my translation. Specifying speech is to specify the general to some of its parts through a proof, through a dalil. Obviously I picked up from the commentary. You have a general statement, all of the stuff that we've been talking about, and then we have a proof, a dalil, that has restricted the general statement to some of its parts. Not all of its parts, but some of its parts. Why did I include that in the translation? Was I want you to know that there is a external thing called the dalil, called the proof, that makes the general statement specific. In other words, you have to, like with the illah, I said, with the ratio legacy, you have to be a detective. You have to investigate where is the dalil that makes that speech specific, not general. Extremists, Salafi, Wahhabis, those type of people, anthropomorphists, all those different type of problematic groups within Islam. This is one of the skills that they lack. They lack the ability to discern. They lack the ability to investigate. They lack the ability to discover these details. You have a general speech. Don't just assume it's general. Maybe it's general linguistically, but is there another dalil, another verse, another hadith, another ijma', an issue of qiyas that has specified it or not? So that's why I translated that way. Specifying speech is to specify the general to some of its parts through a proof, through a dalil. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَقَابِلُهُ حُكْمٌ ثَبَتَ لِمُتَعَدِّدٍ. As opposed to what we just said, a general statement, as opposed to the general statement that has been specified, we have a general statement whose rulings apply to all of its parts. So, بِدِدِّهَا تُعْرَفُ الْأَشْيَاء, as the Arabs say, by opposites things are known. We define the specifying thing, the specifying speech. So what's the opposite of that? It's the general statement that applies to all of its parts. So, فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْ. Whoever sees the moon, the 9th month, the Ramadan, fast. It's a general statement. It applies to all of the subparts. Anybody, any believer, that is, obviously, anybody that's, in Sunni usul, we say that the furu'a of the Sharia are also being addressed to non-believers. So let's just go with that. Everybody, when you see the moon of the 9th month, you have to fast. Is there any takhsis to that? فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ فَعِدَّةٌ مِنْ أَيَامٍ أُخَرٍ. But of those of you who are sick or traveling, then you can make up the days, right? So that's another dalil that comes later in the verse. I mean, it's like right around the corner. It's like the next verse, and it's actually repeated twice in the same verse and in the next verse in Surah Al-Baqarah. But it's the mukhassis, it's that dalil that makes a restricted, meaning if you are physically able and not traveling, then you can fast. So already we have restricted the general statement. So, I mean, maybe you can keep that example. It's a very silly example, I understand, but you don't realize that it is an issue of a general statement that has been specified. I'll pick it up in the next and final clip, inshallah. Okay, so we've just began the section on specifying speech. Let me just read in English the definition that I had, and then we'll pick it up from there. Specifying speech is a takhsis, that is. Specifying speech is to specify the general to some of its parts through a proof, through a dalil, as opposed to a general statement whose rulings apply to all of its parts. Okay, and then he says, rahimahullah, وَالْأَصَحُ جَوَازُهُ إِلَى وَاحِدٍ إِنْ لَمْ يَكُنِ الْعَامُ جَمْعًا أَوْ أَقَلِ الْجَمْعِ إِنْ كَانَ. The correct opinion is that specifying speech can be specified to one as long as the general is not a clear statement, a clear plural statement, like when using the preposition men or the singular definite word, or it can be reduced to the least of plurals, 3 or 2. Okay, that was a long sentence. Let me say that again. So let me take it actually in 3 parts. The correct opinion is that specifying speech can be specified to one. So that's the first thing. So you have a general statement. Can you specify it to the lowest number, which is 1? Yes, if it is not a clear plural. As long as it's not a clear plural, like using men. The preposition men. or you can reduce it to the smallest amount of plural, which is 3 or 2. Remember we said that there's an argument if the less amount of plural is 3 or 2, the dominant position is that it's 3. If you are using a general plural like al-muslimin or muslimat, she said like al-muslimat, the believing, the Muslim women, you could reduce that, or you can make takhsis of that, you can specify that to 3 or 2 if you follow that argument that it's 2. But in the previous example, if you use a plural by using something like the preposition men, you cannot reduce it to 1. It has to be more than 1. But if it's a general plural statement, it could be specified to 1. Okay. وَالْعَامُ الْمَخْصُوصُ عُمُومُهُ مُرَادٌ تَنَاوُلًا. The general statement which has been specified. So this is a construct that when we talk about, up until now we've been in like silos. I talked about the aam and now I'm talking about the khas. But in general, after we go through these courses, moving forward for the rest of your Sharia career, whenever we talk about al-aam and al-khas, we're always talking about them together. So this is a common construct. Al-aam al-makhsus, umumuhu. The general statement which has been specified. Okay? Because you got to put the two together. In reality, when you know the rubber hits the pavement, as we say in English, they're always working together. You're never going to isolate them the way we teach them. We teach them this way so you have a theoretical understanding in your mind, but you have to understand that they're really working together. So the general statement which has been specified, its generality, the general aspect of it is meant in speech, not as a ruling. So we have a general statement, the fasting example that I gave. فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْ. Those who see the new moon of the month of Ramadan, the 9th lunar month of the Islamic calendar, fast. But we said that it's specified to those who are able to fast and who are not traveling. That is where the obligation is, because the other people have a rukhsa. So the general statement which has been specified, the general aspect of it is meant in speech, not as a ruling. So it's a general statement, O you who believe, when you see the month, fast. Okay, but in the tatbiq, in the application of that statement as a ruling, there is a specifying it to it, because there are mitigating circumstances based on dalil, based on proof, that restricts the meaning and specifies it. وَالْمُرَادُ بِهِ الْخُصُوصُ لَيْسَ مُرَادًا بَلْ كُلِّيٌّ اسْتُعْمِلَ فِي جُزْئِيٍّ فَهُوَ مَجَازٌ قَطْعًا. As for the general whose specifying is intended, that's another construct, is that a general statement is used, but its intent is something specific, which is a different type of figurative speech. Its generality is not included in speech or in ruling. So, the example that he gives, وَالَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسُ إِنَّ النَّاسَ جَمَعَكُمْ. So, this is in Surah Al-Imran 173. People who it is told to them, the people have gathered against you, so fear them, فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا, so they increased in fear. Here, Allah Ta'ala is using the plural form, الَّذِينَ, people to whom other people have come and said, fear the people. But these people, الَّذِينَ, is only meant one person, and Naim ibn Mas'ud al-Ashja'i, who was a famous Sahabi of the Prophet ﷺ. He's mentioned by Al-Bukhari. He became, I'm just reading the biography of him, he became Muslim on the night of Al-Khandaq. Okay. So Allah Ta'ala refers to him as people, but he's one person. So this is the general, where I lost my place in here. As for the general whose specifying is intended. So in this, al-aam urid bihi al-khas. This is a general statement that the intent of the general statement is something specific, not something general. So this is, you have to be on the lookout for that, because not every general statement is on by default a general statement. The previous sentence that we just read, just to repeat it, a general statement which has been specified, i.e. through proof, its generality is meant in speech, not as a ruling. Like the example of fasting, it's a general injunction to fast, but then there is some dalil that specifies it. Here we are saying there's a general statement in the Quran or Sunnah, but it is meant for something specific. In this example, the generality is not included in speech or in ruling. So there's no generalness in the speech part, and there's certainly no generalness in the hukum, in the ruling part, because it's aslan, it's in, to start out with, meant for something specific. Rather, continuing, and I had read this in the Arabic, but I'm reading the translation now. Rather, it is an entirety, it is a kulli, used to indicate some of its parts, a juz'i, so it is metaphoric without doubt. Okay, so this is an issue of majaz. Now we go back to thinking about metaphoric speech. So it is a kulli, and we said the kulli has all of these subparts, that the kulliness, the wholeness, applies to all of the subparts equally. It is a kulli, but what is intended is a specific subpart. So alladhina, people, and then Allah Ta'ala is intending this one Sahabi radiallahu anhu, to show his steadfastness. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to make us steadfast against all our trials and tribulations, inshallah. وَالْأَصَحُّ أَنَّ الْأَوَّلْ حَقِيقَةٌ. The correct opinion is that the general, which is specified, and the first example that we just read, is a reality. فَهُوَ حُجَّةٌ. So it is a proof. So a general statement, فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْ, that has been specified, meaning those who are able to. This is a reality, a حقيقة, and therefore it is a proof in the Sharia. And then he says, وَيُعْمَلْ بِالْعَامِ وَلَوْ بَعْدَ وَفَاةِ النَّبِيِّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ قَبْلَ الْبَحْثِ عَنْ الْمُخَصِّصِ. And then the last thing we'll read is that Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. The general is acted upon even after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ and before investigating the specification. So we have a general statement. Obviously, we're all after the passing of Rasulullah to Rafiq al-Ala ﷺ. So therefore, our obligation is to act upon it. That's the default ruling in the Sharia before we have to investigate if it's been specified. So you don't just sit there in the silence, I don't know, maybe it's been specified. No, you got to act on everything even before you investigate. And that's where we'll stop for today. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So in today's class, we finished the discussion on the am, the general statements and the general speech, and we began the discussion on the khas, specifying speech. For the first part of the lecture on wrapping up the general statements, we looked at phrases in the Quran and by extension the Sunnah, of course, Ya ayyuhan Nabi, O Prophet ﷺ, and that is does not include the whole ummah. And phrases like O people, Ya ayyuhan nas, include the Prophet ﷺ, even if there is the command verb qul, to say afterwards. We said it also includes slaves and only those that are present, but it does include others through consensus. We looked at the preposition men, and we said that it also includes women. And we looked at the sound male plural, Jama' Mudhakkar Salim, that it does not include women apparently, because it's the plural form for the men, but it does include women implicitly. It is implied in speech, and we give examples of that. Then we looked at the speech in the verse, O people of the book, Ya Ahl al-Kitab. It does not include Muslims, and I talked about why and how it does include Muslims in some cases. And we looked at the phrase وَخُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ. It means take from their wealth. It means all types of wealth except those that are restricted by a proof. Then we began the section on specifying speech. So we looked at the definition of specifying speech, which is a general statement that's been restricted to some of its parts through a proof. And then we looked at that specifying speech can be specified to one as long as it's not a general clear statement of plural. And then we looked at that you could reduce it to the lowest amount of generality, plural, which is 3 or 2, depending on which opinion you follow. Then after that, we looked at the general statement that has been specified. Its generality is related to its speech, not in its ruling. As for the general statement whose specificity is intended, so it's a different type of figurative speech, the generality is not included neither in speech nor in the ruling. And I gave the example of the fasting verses in Surah Al-Baqarah. And we said rather, if a general speech whose specifying is intended, it's a kulli, it's a general entirety statement that is reduced to some of its parts. And then the last thing is we said that the correct opinion is a general statement which has been specified as a proof in the Quran. And those are the main things that we talked about. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.